Tiny human warblers against a huge swarm of subway-sized earthworms.
Tiny weapons flash and vanish while the huge earthworm swarm keeps tearing the planet.
System check. Confirmation target. One tiny station meets a huge subway-sized earthworm. A tiny human stands beside a huge wall of living earthworm. System check. Confirmation target. One tiny metro line runs inside a huge living earthworm tunnel. A tiny human network lies inside a huge worm-carved route beneath the city. System check. Confirmation target. One tiny street splits for a huge surfacing earthworm.
A tiny runner flees a huge charging wormhead in one narrow street.
System check. Confirmation target. One tiny city grid rides on huge worm-carved fault lines. Tiny buildings slide into huge worm-carved voids beneath their own street. System check. Confirmation target. Tiny probes track a huge living tunnel wall. Each tiny probe hangs beside a huge pore that drops mud like falling boulders. System check. Confirmation target. One tiny East Asian male figure stands beside a huge subway-sized earthworm model. One tiny human column barely appears beside the huge biomass of a single worm. System check. Confirmation target. One tiny harbor rests beside a huge surfacing earthworm. Tiny boats are trapped beside a huge moving wall of earthworm at the shore. System check. Confirmation target. Tiny explorers drift in a huge living soil tunnel. Tiny human bodies are thrown through a huge pulse of moving soil inside the worm. System check. Confirmation target. Tiny generators tap a huge power flow from one earthworm.
A tiny plant grid could vanish beside the huge power curve of one worm.
Tiny lives collapse under the huge force of a rampaging earthworm.
System check. Confirmation target. Tiny desert roads fracture above a huge subway-sized earthworm.
One tiny group of survivors clings to a huge collapsing edge above the worm.
System check. Confirmation target. Tiny forest crowns fall under a huge subway-sized earthworm.
A tiny forest machine is swallowed by a huge moving wall of roots and worm flesh.
System check. Confirmation target. Tiny metro retrofits lie in the path of a huge subway-sized earthworm. Tiny passengers are thrown like dust beside a huge body that shreds their tunnel. System check. Confirmation target. Tiny jet squadrons barely mark a huge subway-sized earthworm. System check. Confirmation target. Tiny jet squadrons barely mark a huge subway-sized earthworm. Tiny missiles burn the sky, while the huge worm keeps tearing the battlefield. System check. Confirmation target. Tiny fleets attack a huge subway-sized earthworm beneath the sea. Tiny torpedoes vanish against the huge armored body of the dark water. System check. Confirmation target. Tiny human worlds fracture under a huge global swarm of earthworms.
Tiny global defenses flicker against the huge swarm that is eating the planet.
System check. Confirmation target. Tiny refuge cities hang above a huge subway-sized earthworm swarm.
Tiny streets in the refuge fall as huge worms tear through the ground beneath. Tiny soldiers and animals cling to ice, while huge worms remake the polar world.
System check. Confirmation target. Tiny bombers track a huge subway-sized earthworm under the polar ice. System check. Confirmation target. Tiny aircraft weave above a huge swarm of subway-sized earthworms.
Tiny passengers and birds are dragged through the huge storm of a worm swarm sky.
System check. Confirmation target. Tiny climates shatter under a huge earthworm swarm.
Tiny seasons twist around the huge scars that worms carve into earth.
System check. Confirmation target. Tiny coastal arcs stand in front of a huge earthworm swarm.
Tiny evacuees and weapons fail as huge worms tear the arc towers from below.
System check. Confirmation target. Tiny fire lines ring a huge earthworm swarm under the crust. Tiny tectonic models fail as the huge earthworm swarm rewrites the planet. System check. Confirmation target. Tiny orbital weapons strike a huge swarm of earthworms below.
Tiny operators watch their strongest blows vanish inside the huge moving maze below.
Check. Confirmation target. Tiny core shields face a huge swarm of earthworms around Earth's heart. System check. Confirmation target. Tiny continents hang over a huge hollow swarm-torn Earth.
Tiny core readings show the huge swarm is hollowing the planet from inside. Tiny survivors cling to a huge broken shell above the moving swarm.
System check. Confirmation target. Tiny life zones unravel above a huge global swarm of earthworms.
Tiny mast species gather on a huge cracked ledge above the moving swarm.
System check. Confirmation target. Tiny drifting habitats cling to a huge broken shell above the swarm.
Tiny daily routines continue on a huge fragment that can fall into the swarm at any moment.
System check. Confirmation target. Tiny hollow fleets attack a huge swarm inside Earth. Tiny pilots field a huge swarm, barely notice their strongest fire.
System check. Confirmation target. Time last ships spiral around a huge shattered Earth of worms.
Tiny eyes watch a huge wounded planet crawling with earthworms.
System check. Confirmation target. Tiny survivors orbit a huge luminous earthworm world.
From one tiny garden ring, the huge transformed planet looks strangely calm and alive.
System check. Confirmation target. Tiny explorers enter a huge living passage inside the Earth.
Tiny sensors map a huge new balance between swarm and surviving life.
System check. Confirmation target. Tiny new skies form above a huge inner swarm.
Tiny voices return, while the huge swarm becomes their distant thunder.
System check. Confirmation target.
From one tiny orbit, the huge wounded world looks like a new kind of star.
System check.
From this tiny viewpoint, the huge swarm planet is only one bright question in the dark.
System check. Confirmation target. Tiny support builds a huge future on Tiny to Huge.